Now let's get back to another developing story, Ireland's response to its growing debt woes. Here's more from Prime Minister Brian Cowen about a potential bailout.
We've made no application whatever for funding. The issue here is, the Minister of Finance has outlined, we have funding up to mid-year because of the pre-funding arrangements done by the National Treasury Management Agency. So the Sovereign, if you like, has that funding arrangement in place. We don't have to borrow any money in respect of the sovereign debt, the sovereign issues that affect the government and the running of the country.
Well, joining us right now to talk more about this, David Kelly, Chief Market Strategist over at JP Morgan Funds. He is from Ireland, trained as an economist, and his father once served in the Irish Parliament. David, good to have you back with Matt and myself. What's your assessment of the situation in Ireland at this point?
Well, I think it's pretty tough for the Irish people. They had a wonderful boom, and now they're going through a very difficult bust right now. But I think the Prime Minister is essentially correct. They don't have to raise money on the market until sometime in the middle of the next year. This is not determined by how markets move. It's determined by the actual, revenues and expenditures of the Irish government and how much money they have on hand. At some stage, if interest rates on Irish sovereign debt stay at this level, close to 10%, it does seem that it would make sense to try and borrow the money from the IMF or from the Europeans at a lower rate rather than try and raise it on the open market. So they may at some stage in the future have to go to Europe. I think that's becoming increasingly likely. But the real issue for Ireland and for investors right now is not when Ireland has to ask Europe for money, but so long as Europe is willing to stand behind Ireland like it stood behind Greece, then I think that reduces the risk of any actual sovereign default to a very small percentage.
Do you have no doubt that Europe will stand behind Ireland at this point, 100%?
I can't say no doubt, because it does depend to some extent on the actions of politicians, and you've heard people like Angela Merkel, as indeed she did in the course of the Greek crisis, wobble somewhat in terms of that commitment. But I think when the Europeans look at the Irish situation, they'll come to exactly the same conclusion they came to with the Greek situation, which is that although they might find it distasteful to be lending money out to a country at a beneficial rate, the truth is to let any of these countries default on their sovereign debt would simply cause a domino effect for all the others, which would be terribly damaging to Europe. I think that's true today. I think that will be true 3 years from now. And so long as these countries are doing what they need to put their houses in order, and Ireland is very committed to deficit reduction, as is most of Europe, so long as Ireland stays on that path, I do think the Europeans will continue to stand behind the debt of all sovereign nations in the European Union.
But David, Angela Merkel, you mentioned her. She has been sort of pushing for the bondholders to take a hit there. Maybe not an outright default, but do you think there's going to be some rescheduling of debt here? Do you think we're going to have to see some restructuring?
I think that any restructuring, I don't know for sure, but I know for sure it's the wrong thing to do. I don't know whether they would go to that extreme, but right now it makes sense for Europe to make sure that the governments are doing the right things to get their fiscal houses in order. They're applying the appropriate medicine, but it also makes sure it's important to make sure that all the bondholders get paid in full and on time on sovereign debt. It's very important to do that because to not do that will simply raise interest rates for all European governments, and that just would not be a good thing to do.
You point out that Ireland made it through the potato famine. They're going to make it through this, but do you think it's going to be rough? The equity markets haven't seemed to price in too much pain.
Well, Ireland is a small country in the world economy. I don't think that it's rough for the global economy, whatever happens to Ireland. It will be rough for Ireland, but as I said, it will get through it. I think Ireland is a very stable democracy. I think that most people in Ireland the political divide is not really one on economic issues, and I think people will buckle down and do what they need to do to pay the taxes, to cut the spending, to get their house in order. I think that's what they'll do over the next few years.
David, what impact would we see in terms of global markets if Ireland isn't able to get this under control, if perchance it doesn't get the funding from the EU?
Well, the real issue is if Ireland will do whatever is necessary to get funding on the same basis that Greece did, as far as I can see. So the real issue is if Europe balked to that. If Europe decides that it's going to let any sovereign nation go, then I think there will be huge trouble, not just with Irish debt, but with Portuguese debt, Spanish debt, Italian debt, Belgian debt, and that could cause another global financial crisis. So it's the very thin end of a very big wedge if you actually let any sovereign government default default. It's precisely because of that I don't think they're going to do it.
I mean, could Europe have its Lehman Brothers, as the United States had here in dealing with the financial crisis?
I think Europe faced its Lehman Brothers with Greece, and it decided to take a different tack. I think it realized that sometimes when you draw a line in the sand, all the sand disappears beneath your feet. And so because of that, they decided they had to support Greece. And Greece actually, in the long run, I mean, Ireland is going back into a current account surplus very shortly here. It is an export powerhouse at its best. I think Ireland will get back on its feet. Greece still, in many ways, has much more long-term structural economic problems than Ireland does. But to let any of these countries go would be, I think, equivalent to letting Lehman Brothers go, and we can see what happened with that. So I think it's, I think Europe took the correct lesson from Lehman Brothers, which is there's a time when you just need to hang together, and I think that's what Europe will do.
Let's bring it back home here, David, and talk about what the Fed is doing with this quantitative easing. A lot of people think it's a very dangerous thing for the Fed to do, and some people think it's not enough money. They need to do more. Where do you fall there?
Well, I don't think it's quite as dangerous as some other people think. I don't approve of it. I think it's the wrong move. But I certainly don't think they need to do more money. You see, I think the problem is this American economy is not suffering from a lack of liquidity. It's suffering from a lack of confidence. And it's kind of like you got an engine which is flooded and you don't have any spark plugs that work, and you keep on pouring more gas into it. You know, this economy needs some spark. And so what I think the Federal Reserve ought to do actually is, if the economy does pick up a little bit over the next few months, I think they should try and avoid fully implementing QE2. I'd much rather see them a few months from now saying, you know what, things are getting a little bit better in the economy, so instead of buying $100 billion worth of bonds this month, we're only going to buy $50 billion, maybe next month $25 billion, phase it out and trying to get out of this this continual quantitative easing, because I think it's not good for the economy in the long run.
But David, they do feed asset inflation, and with higher stock market prices comes more confidence, right?
Well, yes, to some extent, but also for as long as you say interest rates are going to be low, you give people no reason to actually take advantage of low interest rates today. I mean, I've never understood why the Federal Reserve thinks it's so important to say that interest rates will be low for a long period of time. I'd much rather say interest rates will be going up next year, so if you want to buy a house, do it now. If you want to expand your business, borrow the money today. I think that's the message the Fed needs to send to the American economy. Do it now. Don't wait and see. And unfortunately, this open-ended commitment to super low interest rates is only giving people a reason to wait.
All right, we got to leave it there. Hey, David, great to get some time with you. Thank you so much. We really enjoyed it. David Kelly.
You're very welcome.